Inclusive classroom design is when an instructor intentionally plans that their class is going to be accessible to all types of learners in their classroom.
As soon as we start talking about that issue, we get into the idea of things like privilege and oppression. But for the most part, what we're really looking at is what attributes of the students are necessary for us to pay attention to in order for them to be successful.
By including the majority of the most people that you can in the design of whatever you're doing, you effectively reach more people than you would otherwise.
So we really need to look at the whole student and make sure we're supporting them in ways that are necessary for them to develop as students and as individuals.
Well, the benefits of inclusive pedagogy for students is that they are going to, first of all, enter into the learning experience from a place that feels comfortable to them, where they can feel successful. At the same time, because it uses multiple modes of delivery, for example, it also helps the student to maybe develop their capacities in other ways of thinking and learning where perhaps they aren't as strong.
Some of the benefits for students include the idea that we hear their voice. One of the things we know when we take a look at students in a broad perspective is some voices are privileged and some aren't. So as we begin to think about teaching in an inclusive perspective, everybody's voice gets heard, but it also gets valued and understood.
So what do you do to create a class where students feel their voice matters? Sometimes it's as simple as learning every student's name. But then that, of course, inclusive pedagogy is about much more than just knowing everyone's name. But it's that creating an environment where people feel like they belong.
Typically in higher education, a student identifies a disability if that student wants a service. But just because they don't ask for a service doesn't mean that they don't need it.
An inclusive classroom provides an environment where any student can succeed, even if they don't know their disability, they do not have a disability, they have a disability and they are just not comfortable talking to the professor, or they're very comfortable talking to the professor.
Inclusive design relative to professors allows us to better reach our students. Rather than thinking about our students as a small group or that everybody's the same, we want to think about them from a broad perspective. So really the first benefit is we get better learning with our students.
So for example, if you have a student who requires visual information to be displayed in a particular way because they have a visual impairment, okay? The whole class then actually benefits, so there may be other people who benefit from this other way of presenting the information, maybe not because they have a visual impairment, but because maybe they learn differently, or maybe it reinforces how they are taking in information in another way.
The second is our students will tend to engage more, which makes teaching more fun, to be quite honest with you, instead of students just kind of hanging out in class for 50 minutes or an hour and 25.
The instructor also has the assurance that they are treating every student with dignity and respect, and that's part of the principles of community here at Virginia Tech.
Conventional ways of teaching is a lecture. So you have an expert who conveys information, and hopefully they're a very compelling speaker and they know their information well. So that's a great mode of delivery for students who learn best by listening. It may not be as effective for a student who needs to see a process written out, for example, or a student who learns best by doing something.
So from the beginning, try to create activities that allow students to engage with the material in more than one way. So using more than one sense, listening and writing, for example.
If I were to give advice to someone who wants to consider inclusive pedagogy for their class, I would begin by asking them, what is your experience of a learning situation where you really felt engaged and included. And if you think about that experience, that time when you were in that learning situation and how exciting it was and what it did for you as a learner, and then assess what were the features of that environment, you are beginning to identify what it means to do inclusive pedagogy.
If a teacher wants to make their course more accessible, it certainly can be overwhelming to think about. And so probably the first place that I would start would be to look at the syllabus for your course and make sure you have a statement for students with disabilities so that they know that they can come to you during office hours and talk to you about what accommodations they may need in your classroom. The other thing that I would recommend would be to make sure that all of the content that you're providing to the class is accessible. So things like if you are going to be distributing PDF documents, make sure that they are accessible so that if a student has to use a screen reader or software on their computer to read it back to them, that they would be able to do that because the document is accessible.
Always save documents as PDFs instead of print to PDF. It's an interesting difference and you wouldn't think it would matter, but when you save to PDF, anything that's built into the document stays in the document. If you print to PDF, it's a lot like a photocopier. All it does is take a picture and print it out. The last thing that faculty can bear in mind is to avoid communicating in only one way. So a good example of this is sometimes faculty will use color or color coding to represent some kind of organization on a chalkboard or a whiteboard or a digital board, but not all students can see all color spectrums. And just because you can't see all color spectrums doesn't mean that you're going to identify that to the professor. So simple ways that professors could deal with that example are, if I'm going to color code something, I could also underline, box, squiggle, any way to represent in more than one way what I'm trying to communicate. The same thing goes for communications using contractions or pronouns. So for example, if I'm a student who has low vision or blindness, or I'm a student who's learning English, this and that don't always mean anything to me.
The last thing that I would say is that if you have any guest speakers in your class, it's always a good idea to check with them beforehand to see if they plan on passing out any handouts or if they're going to be showing a PowerPoint or a video, to check with them to make sure that their material is going to be accessible to all of the students in your class.
Documents in particular. We use a lot of documents in our curriculum, from PowerPoint presentations to Word documents, PDF documents, and all the other varieties that there are. And those documents, if you don't build accessibility into them, anyone who's using assistive technology essentially sees a blank piece of paper. And for all of the effort that faculty put into their curriculum, it really ought to be enjoyed by their students.
When you look at inclusive design versus accommodation, you see some stark differences. Accommodation puts all of the onus onto the student to be an advocate that for themselves. That implies two main things about the student. One, that they can actually be their own advocate, that they feel comfortable enough to talk to their professor with that different power dynamic and actually be able to talk to their professor about something that they need them to do. And it also implies that the student is comfortable with their disability and they know that they have a disability.
I think for a lot of faculty, shifting from focusing on content to really trying to integrate diversity can be a little scary, can be a little uncomfortable. And it's important to understand that that discomfort is a good thing. It means we're focused on change, and that there are lots of people around to support that. And so if they come and they talk to us, they talk to TLOS, they talk to Office of Diversity and Inclusion, they find other faculty that they're working with as a support group, which sounds kind of odd, but really when we're venturing into new areas, it's important to develop a support group. So recognize at the beginning, it could be a little odd or discomforting, and that's okay.